Hi, I'm Karen. We're here at Montavilla Sewing Center, and today we're talking about FreeMotion quilting. FreeMotion quilting can be lots of fun, but it can be a bit of a challenge, so I'm going to get you started in how to set this up. So, to start with, a quilt looks like this. Now, this is a small quilt. This is just a wall hanging, but usually people think of pieced quilting. Here's another example, and this is a simpler one. This is just the quilt top. So a quilt is made up of the top, the batting, and the backing. So it's like the quilt sandwich. And the purpose of quilting is to get those three layers sewn together so they become one blanket. Now, if you didn't do any quilting, what you'd have is just a free hanging front and a free hanging back and some batting that maybe when you started washing that quilt would kind of pack up and move and shift around. Well, that's the purpose of doing quilting. Now, there's different kinds of quilting. FreeMotion is one of those. In the olden days, before there were sewing machines easily available, ladies would get together and have a quilting bee. They'd sit around a big frame and they'd stitch by hand. It was time-consuming, but it was a good way to get ladies together. Well, we're talking about FreeMotion quilting. I'm going to show you an example of FreeMotion quilting. Here's a little example of, I did this, just kind of playing around with different stitches, white thread on a black background so you can kind of see what it looks like. Now, as I look at this, what I was trying to go for was to have pretty even spaces all the way around, no big large areas and no areas that are too close together or too dense. Another thing I was trying to go for is the stitches that are basically the same distance from stitch to stitch. So you want to have your stitches not too close together and not too far apart. So those are the two things that you want to go for when you're FreeMotion quilting. And it does take practice. It's kind of like when you were learning to write your name, you had to practice and practice and practice, right? And then eventually you got really good at it. Same thing for FreeMotion quilting. Okay, so now when you use batting for FreeMotion quilting, I suggest you use this thinner cotton batting. It's much easier to quilt because you're moving it around as you're quilting. And this thicker batting is really meant for the hand-tied quilts or hand-sewn quilts that we're talking about. It's really not quite as good for FreeMotion quilting. And then, of course, you want to use cotton fabric for your top and for your backing. The cotton fabric is what traditional quilts are made of. Now, some people make quilts out of silk or specialty fabrics, but when you're starting, use the easiest type of fabric. Now, quilting, again, can be pieced, or you can do a whole cloth quilt like this, or you could do a print like this. Now, in this case, what I did is I quilted right along the lines, and you can see what it looks like from the back there. Okay, so you can use a printed fabric and quilt along the motifs. If this was like a flowered fabric with flowers here and there, I can just quilt around each flower, and that kind of gives it added interest as well as doing the job of quilting. Okay, then you need to use good quality thread. I like Metler Metricine. Now, this is the larger cone. On the machine here, I have a smaller spool, but Metler Metricine all-purpose polyester is really my go-to. Now, some quilters like to use a cotton thread, and that's fine. They want their entire quilt to be out of cotton, the batting, the backing, the fabric, the thread. But this is fine for me. I like to have just one set of threads. Okay, and then of course you can use a variegated thread. This happens to be the sulky. It's 30 weight. It's a variegated thread, which would really go very nicely with my pieced fabric here. As you can see, it picks up the colors. This is where you have lots of different colors. You might want to use a variegated thread that kind of adds to but doesn't detract from. I could also quilt this in white, and that would work just fine. And then needles. Now, you want to make sure you have good quality needles. I would recommend a quilting needle. This one happens to be the Schmetz brand, but the Classe also has a good brand. and this is a size 75/11. This type of needle has a type of point that goes easily through the quilt, the batting, the whole 3 layers. So this is what I would recommend. Also, Microtex is another good option too. Microtex is meant to go through layers of woven cotton fabric. Okay, and then we need to have some pins. Now these are flat-headed flower pins. They're nice and long. They're great for going through all of those layers. You want to pin together your quilt sandwich so that when you're quilting, your layers don't shift. I've got some other ones in different colors here, which are nice. The nice thing about these is if you have a large project, these are easy to find. You can see them easily. If one of them drops on the floor, you can pick that right up, and it's easy to find. Another possibility is to use curved safety pins. Now this is especially nice. You can see this is a curved safety pin. This is made so that you can put it in through those layers pretty easily. Nice thing about these is if you have a large bed quilt that you're doing, you want to maybe not have pins in there that you accidentally get your elbow into or whatever as you're shifting your quilt around. So these are nice. Now using pins is a little bit more tedious than just using straight pins, but again, for a large quilt, this may be the thing that you want to do. And then another option is hand basting. Some people will lay out their quilt on the floor and hand baste. That's a little bit more tedious. It is a nice way to do it, but then again, like I say, it takes longer. There is another option, and that's to use spray basting. I'm not a real fan of spray basting because the spray gets everywhere and it's hard to clean up. Another option is to use fusible batting. Most fusible batting, however, just has fusing on one side, not on both sides. So there's downsides to that. My preferred way is to use pins, both the flower head pins and the safety pins. Okay, and then one important way to hang on to your quilt, especially if you have a large quilt, is to use these grippy gloves. These are machingers, and they come in different sizes. Right back here, you can put your hand up there and figure out what size you would need. I would probably need small, medium, maybe large, depending on my fingers. But these have grippy tips so that if you have a large quilt and you're moving it around, you've got a lot of quilting that you're trying to do, this helps you hang on to that quilt. Now, if you have a machine that just has a smaller table like this, often machines will come with an extension table, or you can get an extension table for your machine that slides on. That'll give you a larger area so that your quilt is not hanging off the edge. It's much easier to manage it that way. Then, of course, you need the FreeMotion foot. Now, this one is one that you're probably familiar with. It's the one that this part here goes over the needle bar, and every time the needle goes up, the quilting foot goes up. That makes it so that you can move your quilt along, and then it comes back down as it's making a stitch. So this is what I'd like to call the jumping foot. Now with this machine, we've also got a gliding foot, and there are other machines that have a gliding foot. If you look carefully, this here, that part will glide over your quilt. And there's a little adjustment here so that you can make it, and if you have a little bit thicker batting or just more layers to go through, you want to make sure it glides through, but doesn't stay too far above, because it does need to be close enough to the quilt so that when the needle goes down, it can make it a stitch. So this is a nice feature to have. This machine has it. There are other machines that have it, but a simpler machine may only have this one here, or you can get this as an optional accessory for most machines. Just make sure that you have one. If your machine is, if you look carefully here, this one is a high shank machine. That means the distance between the screw and the bottom of the foot is higher. You may have a low shank. Just make sure that if you get this as an additional accessory, that this one fits your machine. This one happens to be a high shank. The distance between here and the bottom of the foot is a higher distance. Okay, so For machine setup, we want to make sure the feed dogs are down. I'm going to move my foot out of the way so you can see. Right now they are down. For sewing, you'd normally have your feed dogs up like this. So the switch is in different places for different machines. Your machine may have a switch down here, maybe in the bobbin area, or maybe in the back of the machine. Look at your machine manual. You'll usually have a switch that will lower your feed dogs. So in this case, ours is over to the right here. Lower that down. That makes it so now the feed dogs are not in play, and so when I am quilting, I'll show you this more again on the other video. Of course, I would have my foot here, but I would move it around. So basically, I am drawing with thread on my fabric. So remember my analogy about writing. One of the good tips that I got from another teacher here is that try doodling. Do the kind of drawing that you want to do on your quilt on a piece of paper, so you get a feel for what it looks like. Also, you can do, okay, right here, if you look at this one, right there, that is actually a stitch that I got from my machine. It was a decorative stitch. I just copied that. So that is another way that you can find motifs that you can do. Okay, talked about the extension table. When you start quilting, I recommend that you use a new quilting needle, even if you have a quilting needle. If you've been using it a lot, or a microtex needle, every time that goes through the fabric, it gets a little bit duller. So if you've used it and it's been like weeks of sewing, use a new needle. The thing that you don't want to have happen is skipped stitches, because a skipped stitch means now there's double that amount of space, and you can get a longer piece of thread which can catch on things, and it's just not doing its job. Okay, and then plenty of thread on your bobbin. So if your bobbin is only this full here, that's not going to get you very far. You want to make sure and have plenty of thread on your bobbin. Okay. See, feed dogs down, and your machine also may have other features which are really helpful. I like this speed slider on here. What this does is it slows down the maximum speed that I can go. So that way, I'm not dependent on how much I push down on the pedal. I can just set this here, put my foot all the way down on the pedal, and then I don't have to, it just stays at the same speed. That way, I'm only dependent on how quickly or slowly I move my hands to make sure that I get the right stitch length. Again, it's one of those things that you're trying for, but if you don't get it perfect, that's not really what's going to show up so much. You want to attempt it, but don't be so hard on yourself if you can't get it exactly right. Okay, another thing that's nice and helpful to me is, I'm going to put my foot back on here so you can kind of see what I'm doing, is the knee lifter. Now this is this little piece of metal here. That's what it looks like. Not all machines have it, but if your machine does have it, make sure that you use it, because when you push it to the right, your presser foot goes up or down depending on whether you push it. That way, you're not always dependent on this here. Another thing about your FreeMotion foot, it's always going to be a little bit above the fabric. So even if you have your presser foot down, you may forget that your presser foot's up. So that's why having a knee lifter, see, I'm pushing it, it's always going to be down unless I push it to the right. That's another good feature to have. So if you're thinking about getting a machine for FreeMotion quilting, as well as for a lot of other things, speed slider, knee lifter, and plenty of throat space is helpful. So I hope you found this to be a good getting started video. I'm going to have another video on actually doing the FreeMotion quilting. If you found this video to be helpful, give us a thumbs up. And if you have comments or questions, you can leave those in the area down below. We have lots of other videos here on our Montavilla YouTube channel, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye.